She was the wind that rustled in the leaves, could blow it to a gale whose brief foray dropped broken branches in its way, or a breeze that broke the fever of a summer day. She was the bitter wind that drove the snow and cold into one's face and numbed their ears. She was the gentle wind that watched me grow, stayed at my back, and swept aside my fears. Her dreams were supple as the clouds she chased across the sky. They formed the shapes of who and what she'd have me be. The wind retraced the hurts and disappointments that she knew. Her moods churned like a hurricane offshore. She was a woman of a time who wanted more.
You know, there's something almost magical about the way words can shape our lives, our identities, our very sense of self. Today, we're going to talk to someone who has dedicated his life to that magic. Welcome to Author's Insight, where we dive into the stories behind the stories. Today, we have a special episode featuring James Ten Eyck. He's a poet and nonfiction author whose work is as much about the words as it is about the emotions they conjure. But what drives someone to spend their life putting pen to paper, weaving words into the fabric of human experience? Well, that's exactly what we're here to find out. James's journey started in a small study, tucked away in his childhood home. Imagine a young boy, eyes wide with curiosity, surrounded by books that seem to whisper secrets just waiting to be discovered.
Hello, my name is Jim Ten Eyck, and I live in Hyde Park, New York. I'm currently 82 years old. I grew up in Somerville, New Jersey. It's a fairly Republican town, particularly at the time when I grew up, and I grew up in a Republican family. I collected a lot of I Like Ike buttons, so I was wearing a lot of I Like Ike buttons around the town when I was young. And if the voting age had been 18 when I turned 18, I probably would have voted the first time for Nixon. And what changed me from that earlier perspective was the civil rights movement. I thought that Goldwater and the Republican Party under Goldwater had left our family values than the other way around. So by the time I was in college, I was a pro-civil rights activist.
That moment of discovery planted a seed, and like all seeds, it needed time and the right conditions to grow. For James, that growth happened during his college years, in the midst of lectures and late-night study sessions.
My college years started in 1959. I graduated in 59, started college the fall of that year. When I was applying to college, I sort of sailed through high school without really knowing who I was or what I wanted to do. And I applied to, I think, 5 different colleges and 5 different majors. The one I ended up with was Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, which is not far from where I grew up. And it was a fortunate choice. I was lucky because I had advanced credits, or at least I got credit for my placement tests or whatever. I didn't have to take the freshman writing course. I went through the math sequence in 3 semesters instead of the 4 that most other sections of that class went through. So I got a lot of free space. I was a math major as an undergraduate, but I did have an opportunity to take a lot of history courses and a lot of English courses. Instead of taking the freshman writing course, I was in a course where we did things like reading the Odyssey, Greek drama, and some Elizabethan drama. I'm not sure of the sequence now of all of this, but as well as reading the Greek drama, we were reading from the Bible. We were reading things like the Psalms and so forth as literature. But we were also reading, I think it was the book of Saul, the book of Samuel, the story of Saul. And the question was, is Saul a tragic hero in the Greek sense? So it was an interesting course. It was a course that we covered drama from Elizabethan drama, not only Shakespeare, but I think we read Marlowe and the Duchess of Malfi and other plays like that. And it opened my eyes, let's say. And I think I got a college experience that by default, more or less, I could have randomly chosen any of the other colleges. One of the things that decided me was I was there on my own for the pre-selection visitation. And there was a kid from Easton that saw that I was from Somerville and asked me how one of the wrestlers at Somerville had done in the States or so forth. And, so that got us talking. Wrestling was a big sport in the high school those days. So, I got invited to go over to his house and meet with some of his friends. And that was basically, as much as anything, the deciding reason why I went there instead of one of the other places that I had applied to in other subjects. It was very fortunate for me that I made the right choice. I've got a really good education.
The friendships and experiences James gained in college played a significant role in shaping his worldview.
In college, I got to meet a lot of different people. I was in what was called a social dorm, which was sort of a non-fraternity. Because of the fraternity system, a lot of the Jewish kids that weren't able to get into, there was one fraternity, it was a Jewish fraternity, and that also was a fraternity that a lot of the black football players or the black students were in as well. But in the social dorm is also another place that didn't have any racial regulations or who could get in and all of that in those days. So, it was the early 60s. So when you talk about the 60s, you're really thinking of 63 and later, what we know as the 60s these days. I was there with a lot of really bright kids. One of the television programs that they had back then was the College Bowl. And, the various colleges were competing. So Lafayette went all the way. It was they won 5 times, and so they were a 5-time champ. And a couple of the kids that were on that team were also in my dorm. And one of the things, so I got to get to know a number of people. One of my roommates was Iranian. He was Jewish and Iranian, which seems inconsistent, today. But no, he was quite, he was happy of living in Iran. He was telling us all the great things that he was doing. I think after he graduated, he married an American girl and stayed here. So he didn't go back to Iran, fortunately for him. But it was that sort of a time.
Writing isn't just an act, it's a ritual. For James, it begins with finding the right environment and allowing inspiration to flow naturally.
I worked for 5 years at IBM. During that time, they had a program with Syracuse University, where Syracuse professors or whatever would come and teach a course. And, you could get a master's degree that way. That's where I graduated as a math major. But during that period, even during the last years at Lafayette, I was taking more physics courses than some of the math courses. And so I switched over. I was taking physics. I decided, at one point, after I'd been at IBM for about 5 years, that I was going to go and finish the master's degree on campus, and which I did. And then I decided that I was just going to stay, I discontinued my leave of absence, put it that way, and, went back full-time graduate student. That's where I met Veronica at Syracuse. We were married there. We were married, in the chapel. She was Irish. She was from Dublin, and she was Irish Catholic.
It's in these quiet moments where the world fades away that inspiration strikes. Sometimes it's a fleeting thought, a memory, or even just the way the light hits the window.
I like to write. I remember writing some poems at IBM, one of which, I wrote the start of one of the poems that's in the poetry collection that I published. And now that goes back to IBM. And, although they never really came out maybe until later, I wrote some poems when I was in graduate school as well. And some of them, would be poems that are in the current collection, at least in one form or another. The original poems I had lost. I'd stored them on a floppy disk on a language that was now obsolete. Well, I lost them on the disk. I actually had found some that were printed out. I didn't find them until after Veronica died. But in the meantime, I had remembered some of them. Had remembered not necessarily the whole thing, but I'd remembered certain lines, certain images, and things that I could, just take off and go to rewrite.
James's work spans genres and styles, each piece a new exploration of the human condition. His first novel, a deep dive into personal experience and the lives of those around him.
One curiosity about Walter Reuther today is when this podcast is being recorded, today is the 54th anniversary of Walter Reuther's death. He died in a plane crash going to the UAW retreat, which was going to be housing one of the first conferences on environmentalism. One of his causes toward the end of his life was the environmental movement. And, he was a big supporter of Earth Day.
James was drawn to Reuther's story not just because of his significant contributions to labor rights, but because of the broader implications of his activism.
Reuther was this symbol, this hero, and so forth. And he's a man who had many tremendous qualities. He was of tremendous significance for that whole period. But he had frailties, like, every person. His record on civil rights, well, here he was out front at the March on Washington and at various other marches that he conducted with King, etc. But because of internal politics, as much as anything, he was resistant to a black chair, let's say a black seat at the UAW, that he was slow, let's say, in the advancement of blacks within the UAW was slower than it should have been, not just because of Reuther, etc. But Reuther was a politician as well. And he's heading this, it's not like a company so much even, where the chairman of the company and so forth can run afoul of the stockholders and so forth. But he wasn't up for election every 2 years or anything like that. So, Reuther had a somewhat conservative base in his governing committee. The more liberal activists were part of his entourage, his staff, let's say, put it that way. So there was that aspect, that he wasn't perfect, but, he was significant.
And his poetry, it's a playground of form and emotion, a place where rules are bent and feelings are laid bare. Listening to James read his work is like being invited into his world, to see through his eyes for just a moment. Here's an excerpt from his latest collection of poems.
Conversations of Twilight. A full-faced moon, soft and pale, hung in a sky no longer dark but not yet blue, entwined in branches reaching up above a snow-clad roof. Come to the window, have a look. The scene is special and the moment not to last. No, I cannot move. I'm cold and sore and saw it all before. I saw the moon fully round, escape a leafy grasp in Herbert Park, to bathe the pond that sleeping ducks call home, where winter's not so long and stark. Come to the window, have a look. The fireflies are thick tonight and twinkle like the stars above in the fleeting glow of twilight. No, we saw the sky at Selkirk shores expose its complement of stars, the night we camped beside the lake to consummate the vows we took. The summer here's too hot and close. I long to feel the wind from off the sea and know a familiar heavenly face above both head is staring down at me.
James's personal life is just as compelling as his professional one. Meeting Veronica was a turning point that added a beautiful new dimension to his journey.
She received a PhD in psychology. But before that, she was in language. She came to Syracuse as a language student. Her main foreign language at the time was Italian. She had studied French. She had worked in Italy. She and her friend from UCD, University College Dublin, both came together. They flipped the coin, whether it was going to be Europe or the United States, and it came up the United States. And so they tried to get an assistantship, somewhere, and they both got an assistantship in Syracuse. So that's as much the reason she ended up in Syracuse as any other. And so they were there. She was telling me, one of the things that she had to do on the assistantship was she was teaching Italian. And so they were two kids right off of the boat, more or less. Well, not off of the boat, but, in the general expression of that. And so one of her first classes was teaching Italian, and one of the students in the class was Floyd Little. And he was a delight because I think he became a lawyer after his football career ended. But he was a serious student, and he tolerated no harassment or anything from the other classmates. And then Veronica switched out of language. She was in psycholinguistics, and then just into adulthood and aging is where she got her PhD in. We met in Syracuse, and we ended up falling in love and getting married, and our son was born in Syracuse too. So a lot of fond memories of Syracuse.
James's reflections on his personal life and the deep connections he forged remind us that behind every great writer is a lifetime of experiences. These experiences not only shape their work, but also fuel their passion for the craft. As we draw to a close, James shares his thoughts on his work and the legacy he hopes to leave behind.
Well, I think I did the best I could. It's a book not just about Walter Reuther. It's about the life and times of Walter Reuther. So I think I tried to be as even-handed as I should have been. Being a scientist, let's say, was a benefit. I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't, somebody that was particularly involved. I wasn't a politician or had any kind of a relationship with politicians. But I was a scientist, so I could look at the facts and, try to be as fair-minded and, as I could. So I think I tried to capture that in the book, and I hope I did. Well, the book is available on Amazon. Presumably, it might be more available, by the time this airs and so forth. You can find more information about the book, about me, on my website, which is just www.jamesteneyck, all one word, all lowercase, .com.
James Ten Eyck's story is a testament to the power of perseverance and the magic of words. His journey reminds us that writing isn't just about putting words on a page. It's about capturing the essence of life itself. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Author's Insight. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the life and mind of James Ten Eyck. Stay tuned for more captivating conversations with authors in future episodes. Until next time, keep reading and keep writing.
One curiosity about Walter Reuther today is when this podcast is being recorded, today is the 54th anniversary of Walter Reuther's death. He died in a plane crash going to his, the UAW retreat at, forgetting the name of the place, it'll come to me, which was going to be housing one of the first conferences on environmentalism. One of his causes toward the end of his life was the environmental movement. And, he was a big supporter of Earth Day. He spoke at the first Earth Day at his daughter's college. And he was going to I'm trying to remember the name of the place, and it's 82-year memory. So anyhow, he was going to go to see that the place was ready to house this conference, which would be a preparatory conference for the first UN conference on the environment. And the environment back in 1970 was as much about the pollution and the quality of the environment as much as it was to become about climate change. That was more of an issue among the scientists and so forth at that time that hadn't become part of the public concern about the environment. But, the pollution, the polluted rivers and lakes, the polluted air, that was a prime concern. And so he and his wife, and the architect, that developed this resort. It was a resort for the UAW workers. One of the benefits that he saw for the resort was, that working at on the assembly lines in Detroit and so forth, was a brutal type of existence, and it caused a lot of strains, in marriages and so forth. So it was a way for couples to get away from Detroit and the pressures that they had to spend a few, whatever time they had there, a few days or a week or so, together to go into a more rural atmosphere and, just try to renew some of their, of the love they had during their marriage. So there was a conference center, for the UAW officials as well. So that's where he was. He was heading to check out the resort, everything, which was newly completed, and he wanted to make sure that everything was completed and ready for this conference that was upcoming a few weeks later. He was on a plane. It was, a private jet. It was the plane that, the Wichita lineman, Glenn Campbell. Glenn Campbell was giving a concert in Detroit. And, he flew into Detroit on this plane. And then there were two airports in Detroit. So Glenn Campbell flew into one, and the plane was transferred to the other. And that's where Reuther boarded. But the plane had an altimeter failure. It wasn't the first plane that Reuther was on that had altimeter problems, but this one had an altimeter failure, and there was a problem with the lighting at the airport runway where he was to come in, and so he was coming in on an alternate runway, and with the altimeter, it was a rainy night. And so they were using the altimeter and so forth to guide the plane into the landing area, and it was too low. It struck some trees and crashed, and everybody on board was killed. So that's the 54th anniversary of Walter Reuther's death. Is said. Why? Yeah. 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 First of all, it's the life and times of Walter Reuther. So it's not as much a biography as it is a story of the times of that particular period. So Reuther was a particularly appropriate protagonist because he was involved in so many of the movements and so forth of the day. And secondly, he was somebody who a bit of a hero of mine at the time because of his stance, and civil rights. His public stance, most notably, was on the stage at the Lincoln Memorial, giving one of the addresses, when King gave the "I Have a Dream" speech that at the event. So, he was somebody that was expressing some of the feelings that I was feeling at that time. And I worked summers when I was going to my undergraduate college in a factory near Somerville that made asbestos shingles and asbestos siding and so forth. So it was a big factory. It had a lot of summer help that went there, a lot of students and faculty, high school teachers. So not so many at that point, but some of them were working there as well. So it was a place where we could get a job. The health hazards, were something that, I guess maybe too many of us ignored at the time. But the main thing at that factory was, first of all, well, I won't go into that. The main thing at that factory is that we were all getting the same wage, the same hourly rate. So everybody, whether they were working there for 25 years or whether they were just a summer, replacement for somebody, would make the same rate. The only advantage that the more senior people had was they had first dibs at different workstations that paid a higher, bonus rate, let's say. But that was very insignificant that I could tell. There was, we got a bonus rate, as long as the system was running, the line was running, we were making a bonus. So it was just when things, when something happened, that produced a lot of scrap on the line that I was working on, then things got shut down for a while and you didn't get the bonus. But that was not a very significant, part of the difference, let's say, between us that were just there working for the summer and the people that have been working there for 15, 20, 25 years. And, it didn't seem fair. That plant didn't have a very strong union. And I think with a better union, people might have gotten better results. The workers might have gotten better results. So, yeah, the stance on civil rights, which is not unqualified as you turn out to dig into his story, and the labor. I was pro-union, let's say. So, but it's not only that. The main reason was that he was the protagonist for a story about this era of liberal ascent, let's say, this era of progress where uh, I guess I'm getting a little bit behind myself. It was about the 20th century and the changes that were made in the 20th century that, were significant, let's say, to what modern day America is. And right now, significant in the sense that we're facing a lot of the same questions, the same scenarios right now. And, that those are the advances of the 20th century, or the first two-thirds of the 20th century at any rate, were significant and have been under attack, let's say, ever since. So that was part of the reason for writing the book. It's The Life and Times of Walter Reuther, an Unfinished Liberal Legacy. And I wrote it also at the time, not that it was going to have all that much influence, but I just wanted to state my position that the word liberal was being used as a pejorative by, the people that did not approve of some of the changes and so forth that took place in the 20th century. And it was not being defended adequately by the people that should be defending it. So that was another reason for writing the book. And Reuther was the natural protagonist for the book. I admired him. And he was involved in all of the activities of the 20th century, that I was writing about. Well, it's in retreat. It's in retrenchment. Now the labor movement is asserting itself once again, but it's been a long time. I think one of the things that happened at the end of this period, which was the late 60s into the 70s in particular, at the time of Reuther's death and afterward, was that the economy was switching from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, probably a bit prematurely. The technology wasn't all that ripe at the time. And that's part of the reason why there was such stagflation in the 70s and to the early 80s, because the technology wasn't quite ripe, to accommodate this transition. There was still a lot of paper and pencil, technology that was used in the offices and so forth of the time. So there wasn't the same efficiency, let's say, in office work that there is today back at the start of this period. But, the labor was on the back heel. One of the failures of Reuther was every leader and so forth needs to groom their successor. That's, supposedly that's like a failure of Obama that, once he left office, a lot of the positions, let's say, in the states in particular, control of Congress and so forth, and then the loss of the presidency was there. So that could be part of the blame, that Obama should have done more, build up the institution of the state legislatures and so forth, the courts, than he did. And that's part of the situation today. But by the time, this period of the industrial period was ending, the labor had put itself into a bind. And the people that built the labor unions that went on strike at Flint in the 37, 36, 35, 36 into 37, the people at Ford and so forth, and the people at the start and after the war, that built the middle class through the union movement. They were now fairly comfortable. They were old, they were retiring, and who was going to be the next generation of labor activists to take on that role? One of the things that happened earlier on in Reuther's time was after he became the head of the UAW. He was elected president in 46, but it was a very tenuous job that he had. His opponents were all set to get rid of him in 48. And he managed to defeat that effort. And that's when he really became the head of the UAW. And that's when they negotiated some of the main contracts, et cetera. The Treaty of Detroit, I would use the Treaty of Detroit to be a series of labor negotiations or labor treaties or labor results, let's say, during the whole period of the early 40, from 1940 on through 6 into the 60s, let's say. But the Treaty of Detroit was the contract of 1948, 49. Maybe it was a little later than that. I think it was actually 50. It was right at the start of before the Korean War broke out, and it was a longer term, like a 5-year contract instead of the usual 2 or whatever. And that was too long. The Korean War broke out. It changed the whole circumstances of what the economy was going to look like. And Reuther had to go and renegotiate it, afterward. But during that whole period, right after Reuther became the head of the UAW, it was, I think, in early 1953, both William Green, the head of the AFL, died, and so did Phil Murray, the head of the CIO. So at that time, the activism in the CIO had declined. The AFL was the bigger union. The AFL was the union of the carpenters and the plumbers and people like that, whereas the CIO was the industrial workers. And those two, one. I remember that the only thing we learned about things like that in high school was one of them was vertically organized. The CIO was vertically organized. The AFL was horizontally organized. So at the start of the CIO, one of the problems was that the AFL would put the workers into what they called federal unions. The federal union was just a name for putting them all into some bin until we decided which of these types of work were more like plumbing and carpentry and electrical work and so forth. In other words, they were going to divide them horizontally, which was an anathema, to the industrial workers. But by 53, when Murray particularly Murray had died, William Green was replaced by Meany. So Meany became the head of the AFL. And I guess Reuther made the mistake that he thought he could work with Meany, that combining the two unions, would produce more momentum for, trying to organize, some of the non-unionized workers. You had the farm workers at one end, but you had, the teachers and the civil servants and, the usual white-collar jobs that could have been unionized. So that was the role that Reuther was envisioning. But it was also the reason for taking that job, which he was not suited for, was that he was afraid that it would go to the steel workers and that the head of the steel workers union would have the job and he would take the CIO or take the steel workers into the AFL. So it was to forestall that from happening. There's always a rocky relationship between autos and steel throughout the whole early period of labor organizing. They were, I could go into that, but let's leave that. And so he was averting it going to the head of the, eventually anyway, going to the head of the Steelworkers Union. And they hated each other, the two men. Reuther was not, Phil Murray was the ideal person to head this umbrella organization of all these different unions. He was Uncle Phil, and all the office workers loved him, and he was the congenial type of person. Reuther was very driven, let's say. So he was nothing like Uncle Phil, and he was not a good person to lead an umbrella organization where he was just trying to facilitate. Where the job was to facilitate, the efforts of the individual unions under him, not to be in charge. So Reuther had to play first violin in every orchestra that he played in. This is one way of describing him. And so that was a mistake. And, it became, more and more of a mistake as they went along. And, for the AFL, they weren't interested in expanding. They were happy the way it was. There was no motivation for them to try to encourage the unionization of these other fields. They were not helpful in, the farm workers organization at all. And that was, it became a problem. Reuther eventually left the AFL and formed a new combined union with the Teamsters, who had the history of corruption that the UAW never had. And, I guess Hoffa, by this time, I think he was already dead, or if they at least suspected of being dead. So Hoffa was out. Fitzsimmons was the leader of the Teamsters. But, there was still a lot of corruption with the Teamsters. That particular marriage was not made in heaven, put it that way. And it didn't work. But the people who actual next generation union activists were the black workers. And I guess Reuther wasn't quite ready to go there. I guess when I started writing the book, Reuther was this symbol, this hero, and so forth. And he's a man who had many tremendous qualities. He was of tremendous significance for that whole period. But he had frailties, like every person. His record on civil rights, well, here he was out front at the March on Washington, and at various other marches that he conducted with King, etc. But because of internal politics, as much as anything, he was resistant to a black chair, let's say a black seat at the UAW. That he was slow, let's say, in the advancement of blacks within the UAW was slower than it should have been, not just because of Reuther, etc. But Reuther was a politician as well. And he's heading this, it's not like a company so much even, where the company, the chairman of the company and so forth can run afoul of the stockholders and so forth. But he wasn't up for election every 2 years or anything like that. So, Reuther had a somewhat conservative base on his governing committee. The more liberal activists were part of his entourage, his staff, let's say, put it that way. So there was that aspect, that he wasn't perfect, but he was significant. He was, a truly great person, I think. But truly great people have faults. So that's one thing that came out with it. And the other thing, was what comes up goes down a lot of times. That it's like the situation. One of the early chapters was the 20th century, the American century. And I won't have time to go into all of that. But some of the aspects of the 20th century that are still around, the attitude toward race, the idea of white supremacy, the idea towards immigration, the attitudes toward the immigrant were not too much different, back in the 1900s, in that period, that they are now. In fact, you had the 1924 Immigration Act, which restricted immigration, mostly from non-European countries. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Asian Exclusion Act, etc. And even within European countries, there was, the attempt was made, we don't need so many Italians and so many Poles and, people that aren't from either the Anglo-Saxon, Teutonic, the Irish came earlier, so there were a lot of them that were already in the United States that faced their difficulties, when they immigrated, but now they were part of the fabric. So, we can't say anything so much about, why the Irish aren't so undesirable. But, all of these other races were deemed less desirable, let's say, than the Anglos. It was changing, the fear was changing the nature of the culture of the country, which exists today, obviously.
Step back into the roaring currents of the 20th century through the eyes of Walter Reuther, a man at the heart of America's transformation. From the rise of Hitler in Europe to the factories of the Soviet Union, Reuther's journey shaped the labor, civil rights, and environmental movements. Witness his visionary ideas from war production to the Peace Corps, influencing presidents and policies. Dive into The Life and Times of Walter Reuther, a story of courage, leadership, and legacy. Available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.